You're now plugged into the Delphi podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Delphi podcast. I'm your host, Tommy, and today I'm joined by Smokey, the co-founder of Berachain. Smokey, what's going on?
Hey man, good to have myself here, and thanks for having me. What's going on your end?
I've just been listening to all the Berachain content, and the vibes are really good. You guys have created something really interesting here.
Thank you, man. You're too kind. I wish that all podcast hosts had the same preps game as you. I guess I'll make these questions even more interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy too, because like I heard the story on you guys starting with NFTs and then then doing the chain, but for some reason you've kept this level of like fun and excitement and like memes and not taking stuff too seriously. And it seems like that's actually like a pretty solid plan. It's worked well.
Yeah, thank you, man. I think that for us, like as super quick context, like myself, my co-founder Papa, spent the vast majority of our first careers or our past lives, I suppose, in much more suited up contexts, like building traditional companies and working in VC and whatnot. And I think we realized that if we're gonna if we're gonna play in a field like crypto, why would you do that without having a bit of fun? I also think that we just realized very much from the beginning and from like the early Berachain community that the way that we won or the way that we find edge is not going to be by coming off as like suit chain or like trying to be the most buttoned up guys in the room. I don't think it leans into our personalities on one hand, nor does it lean into the strengths of our community. So I think that's always been about curating a good and authentic vibe, right? It's not forcing people to do X or Y action. It's not playing into whatever the demands of the mob are. It's just let's try to do right by people and also have a good time with it.
Yeah, it's such a gray, like slim line, right? Like on one hand, you could have a community just, go crazy with memes, not explain anything, and things sort of become a joke. And then on the other hand, you could foster like this community that everyone's welcome in, and you got some Chad devs in the background cooking. So it's a fine line, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that like we've seen we've seen the good and bad of that spectrum. Actually when Berachain started or like when we first started like talking about it, there was a joke that was like Berachain is not real, right? And I think that was like sort of like the psyop marketing meta of like 21, 22 timeframe perhaps. And actually, I think we went a little bit too far with it because a lot of people like genuinely thought that we weren't real, which is like pretty funny when it comes up in conversation later. But has led to a number of occasions where I'm like, no, like I swear, like this is legitimate. This is not just like a straight up meme. So I think that
I
we've
promise.
started airing. Like, bro, trust me, bro, please.
Bro, please.
Bro, just one more meme, bro. So like, we've gotten more to the latter side of that spectrum, thankfully. And I think that now people are like, oh shit, like, there's a functioning product. There's a whole bunch of teams building here. There's a lot of social proof. There's like a pretty welcoming community. And I think that the other thing is like, it's really easy for a community to cross the line between welcoming and cringe. And while there's certainly times where I've been like, what the fuck, man, like that's pretty cringy. I think 9 out of 10 times I can say that the guys keep it pretty real in that like they are a unique sort of like crunchy feels that the right word here. That like, it's not all like wag me, I love crypto. Like, sure, there's certainly undertones there, but I think like people who've been around for a little while and who think that the Berachain ecosystem strikes a pretty nice happy medium between like the left and right curves. It's like, cool, I can be sniffing glue and talking about JPEGs of bears, or I can go deep on like proof-of-liquidity and what that might mean for the interplay between liquidity and security at the chain level and implications for applications and stakeholder analysis and yada yada yada, right? So I think having a community that like isn't corny is something that we care about a lot as well, because I think it's so easy to like cross into like ape land, right? Or even other ecosystems I see forming right now that can sometimes push that a little bit further than I probably would.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, I'm excited to get into all these different points, but while we're riffing on this, it I feel like it gets really hard to maintain that community and that vision and that vibe as you grow and decentralize, right? Like as you go to testnet, as you go to mainnet, like I don't know. Do you think that'll be a problem, or do you think you could maintain
Yeah,
sort of this
totally.
community?
No, it's tough, man. I think that like if you look at even like massive social apps, when I think about crypto, I really do think of it as like a social game in many senses. Like it is a lot about like the connections that are formed. It's a lot about like these mini microspheres and microcosmic communities that are built. And it's tough to scale those. I think that the only way it works is if you actually are able to have like social nodes in a network scale as that network community scales as well. Which is to say that like one person can only evangelize or really form meaningful relationships with so many people, I think you need enough folks who are willing to take on that role and who are able to take on that role. And to some extent, that can just be your regulars in the Discord, that can be the mod team, that can be core team members. But I actually think that like one of the best examples of like this having happened before that I've seen was like probably the Chainlink ecosystem, which I'm a big fan of, and a group that I've got a lot of respect for in one of the OG crews, like to sort of like actually pull off that left curve, right curve playbook, and that you started having these like these figures pop up and become their own like mini figureheads within part of a larger ecosystem. And I think that that's really what we would ideally see, and what we've actually seen in many cases so far. But just an effect that we'd hope continues to multiply. You want those names that people recognize that are not the core team, that are someone who's just in the eco but fucks with it really heavy. And I think that is one of the most beautiful things possible when it actually works. It also doesn't work a ton, but like when it does work, it's nice.
Yeah, it's so hard to give like if throw my VC hat on, like it's so hard to give advice to replicate what you're doing because from like a foundational level, what you have to do is create something just brutally unique, right? Like you're not creating a copy pasta chain,
Completely.
like you know what I mean? Like you're giving people space to become those leaders in their respective areas. Like there's no marketing team here, there's no paid ads. Like I think whenever I get those like web 2 fintech kind of vibes where we're just going to scale this up with services, it just kind of checks me out a bit.
No, honestly, and like when you look at like I don't know, power laws are evident across the entire world. You've seen this as a VC as well, I'm sure, right? Like, I think in crypto that the vast majority of the, let's say, profits, volumes, TVL, whatever you want to call it, from a given platform, come at least right now from a relatively small cohort of users, right? And if you lose connection with those users, then you've kind of shot yourself in the foot. And I do find that most of those, especially natives, tend to be pretty turned off by the classic like pay to play, and or like paid acquisition type work. And also, it just doesn't work very well in crypto from all of the research that we've done, right? So I think that like keeping it real does have a lot of positive EV. And then I think the other side of that equation is exactly what you noted at first, which is like the entire part. But there is no playbook because every time you sort of have to reinvent the playbook when you're doing growth stuff, right? I think that crypto is a space that is rife with forks and also one that moves incredibly quickly. And with that, like novelty wears off really fast, I think.
Yeah.
So I've had so many people ask us about like, oh, like how do we do this, or how do you pull this off? And in many cases, like my answer's been, I'm not quite sure, because I think in many cases it's a little bit of lightning in the bottle, and then just like planting the right seeds that might lead to good outcomes along the way. But in many other cases, it's simply you have to try something new and audacious, and it could crash and burn, or it could work really well, right? And every now and then the coin flip works in your favor.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. One of our portfolio companies is Grass, the crypto AI project, and they
Yeah.
sort of have a very similar vibe, right? Like killer memes, great vibes, but Chad devs on the other side. So it's just a winning situation when you can find it.
Also, some Toronto boys. They've been in our office a couple times, and they're old friends.
Nice. Yeah. Well, so Berachain is real. Tell me about what Berachain is. Like you're an L1,
Yeah,
EVM compatible. Let's just walk through the high level there.
for sure, man. So yeah, Berachain is an EVM identical L1, that is built and powered by Proof-of-Liquidity, which allows users and participants in the network to turn their liquidity into security and use that to power the applications building on the chain. What that functionally means is that their flow of rewards, or the flow of incentives, if you will, on Berachain are sort of upside down from what you would typically see in a proof of stake network. In order to gain the governance and emissions/rewards token of the network, which is called BGT, or the Bera governance token, users actually have to do the work of providing liquidity to different protocols on Berachain. This starts with a couple of DeFi primitives that are effectively baked into the chain. So when the chain goes live, they'll sort of be a DEX, like ambient liquidity DEX, a perps vault, and a stablecoin lending platform. And over time, with a full EVM environment, people will be able to deploy whatever application they want on top of it. And validators actually function as the effectively distributors of these block rewards across contracts on the chain. So each validator has their own gauge. You can think of this like curve style, where they choose to say, every time I propose or produce a block, X% of my block reward will go to this application, X% will go to this application, X% will go to this application, or this pool within it for that matter. And this becomes pretty exciting over time, because what it means is that for the first time, as new applications are building on the network and choosing to deploy on Berachain, they can actually pass a governance vote to become part of that eligible set of gauges that validators can distribute emissions towards. So it really means that, we're building an ecosystem that I think puts power in the hands of the applications and the users, as determined by the validators and those who have provided the most liquidity or value as we see it in tangible form to the network. So you could be building, an NFT-fi platform. You could be building a social platform. You could be building, a delta neutral vault. And in any of those situations, you can have emissions from the chain itself being funneled towards your protocol, which I think just becomes really exciting because, when we think about crypto scaling for the next 10 years, let's say, I think that the black pill that I've certainly taken, and I think that a lot of my friends in the builder space have taken, is that infrastructure has largely become a meme. And it's, perhaps taboo to say that as someone building an L1, but I very much think of Berachain and Proof-of-Liquidity as a whole as an accelerant for the application layer, and something that's actually meant more than anything else to drive value to applications building on the chain, such that, if we think about what a world looks like in a few years, there's a chance of that moonshot, that multi-billion user protocol that actually breaks out of the cryptosphere, if you will, to have reached activation energy by having its liquidity bootstrapped, its user base incentivized, et cetera, through Berachain. So yeah, man, hopefully that's helpful with some context. I just threw a bunch of words at you. There's a whole bunch of other nuance in there, but hopefully that gives us something to start with.
No, this is helpful. So I was a little confused when I first heard the thesis, right? So let me feed it back to you just for the listeners who might be hearing it for the first time. So basically, the way I understand it is that the only way to earn your native token is to provide liquidity to applications within Berachain, right? This could be a DEX, this could be a perps vault, whatever you want. And if you're a user and you're providing liquidity, you earn some, Berachain native tokens, BGT. But the percentage of tokens and the quantity is ultimately decided by the validator. So the validator set a gauge, tokens flow to applications, then tokens flow to users. Is that like the right mental model?
You've totally got it, man. It's like, we've played with the term top down liquidity, and that validators are effectively streaming those rewards to applications. Applications are then giving those rewards to the users who actually utilize those applications. And then the metagame, or the layer that becomes evident on top of that actually basically becomes the first time that we really see a strong degree of validator and protocol overlap or interaction. Beyond like LST type stuff, is when applications can actually work directly with a validator on the network to incentivize liquidity for their own token or their own app, right? So if one has seen these sort of incentives and or bribe systems and like the Curve and Convex ecosystems, you could think of it in a relatively similar way, or Velodrome or Aerodrome for that matter, where users can an application can actually say, hey, instead of doing a highly dilutive liquidity mining program where I pair my token against X and then give away more of my token, I can choose to incentivize a validator with X amount of my token. And that validator can choose to direct Y amount of BGT emissions towards my application or my pool, whatever I've chosen to incentivize, such that users can actually be rewarded for that interaction, right? And what that does is it means that the application is actually subsidizing their own costs effectively and receiving BGT emissions instead of having to print more of their own token. And on the other hand, it actually means that they're being able to distribute these tokens to validators and their delegates, et cetera. So that opens up a revenue stream for validators, and it opens up, I'd say, a new degree of game theory, a new degree of like choice for users, so that they can choose to work with and delegate to a validator that is helping bootstrap liquidity or bootstrap utilization for application A versus application B, which we think is also pretty cool when it comes to just like solving general problems around stake centralization that we've seen rampant on both Ethereum and Cosmos chains over the last few years.
No, it is pretty cool. I mean, it's definitely like it's very fundamentally different from other L1s that I've seen or spoken with, right? It also sounds like you have a lot of different specific parties here, right? Like when I gave my flowchart before, like validators to applications to users for the native token, the users holding the native token then have the power in making the active decision on where they want to, I guess, delegate to a validator who's making the best decisions to get them the most rewards.
You've got it, right? And that actually opens up some pretty interesting, like, flywheel / compounding purposes, right? You could have a user that's actually just like a major whale in, let's say, a stablecoin pool. And they could say, hey, I've got, these random tokens, or I've got like, these volatiles, and I'd like to bribe a validator with these so I can juice more yields for my stablecoin pool because I believe that will ultimately be an easy positive trade, and I'll get more yield, on my stables per amount of incentives that I gave to this validator. The more common situation that we would expect is a protocol saying, "Hey, I want to bootstrap my own liquidity. I'm going to, give some tokens to this validator instead of doing a liquidity mining / bonding program, and use that to get a whole bunch of BGT emissions that people will want for LPing my pools." Right. So I think that there's a number of different degrees of freedom that people can operate with. And I think that goes back to the whole thesis / the tagline that, actually one of our friends from Hashkey Capital first threw at us, which I really loved, which is Berachain is really a playground for infinite economic games.
I love that
And I
line.
think the degree, I heard them.
I
I was like,
love that
damn, that
line.
bangs.
It's so good. That might be the podcast title.
And it's true though, right? Like the degree of interplay between different parties here is, I don't want to say unlimited, but I think there's a greater degree of freedom and interaction that we've seen in many other, if any, systems to date. And I think that's what makes it really cool because you can, choose your own adventure on Berachain. And I think that's what, leads to interesting new experiments that can ultimately catch fire.
I love it. So, I mean, I'd love to talk through what this drives and what the app ecosystem on the chain looks like, right? Like you've recreated it, or not recreated, you've fundamentally redesigned how applications attract incentives, how users like earn from that, and sort of the whole life cycle here. So, I mean, just kind of like walk me through this. Does this lead to more applications on Berachain? Does this lead to different applications? Does this lead to a higher velocity of applications coming and going? Like what like how does this
Yeah,
look?
for sure. I think that what it does lead to is ultimately more shots on net. And that I think that a lot of applications see the potential to actually go from, 0 to 1 on Berachain by using proof of liquidity and tapping into that as really their nitro, right? Or their turbo, whatever you want to call it. That makes it easier to take an application that's maybe getting off the ground, has a couple million TVL, a few hundred users, whatever it is, and find a way to actually amplify that potential. And I think that on one hand, it leads to a wider crowd of applications. But I think that a lot of it comes down to almost like the cultural differentiation, if that makes sense. The ecosystem team and the foundation team is quite active in the Berachain ecosystem. And, we are talking to teams on a daily, if not hourly basis, I should say. In fact, my teammates are doing real work right now while I'm yapping over here. But what that means is we actively encourage those groups that we don't try to talk to the guys who are building things we've seen 10 times before. We don't care for the next Aave fork. We don't care for the next Uni V3 fork. No offense to those boys, of course. It's more just it's more just we don't want to be the place where you go and see a bunch of stuff that you've seen before and that's that. Cool. Right. I think we want Berachain to be the place where you actually go and say, holy crap, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I've never thought of or never seen before. And how do I start playing with this right away? So I think that what proof of liquidity is meant to do is, give any given application a boost. I think that it perhaps particularly favors those that have a high velocity of capital and that rely quite a lot or have a greater dependence on some degree of massive inflows and outflows at any given point in time. So when you think about your power perps protocols, your 0 day to expiry options, even stuff that can be in the social space that relies on I'd say speedy, liquidity dynamics, there's 100% ways to plug in there. There's even been designs on how you could use that to power a Blur-esque NFT marketplace powered by POL, right? So there's a lot of room in that design space. But I don't think it pigeonholes to a given type of apps. And then in terms of how it affects them the most, I think it just means that you actually have applications more incentivized to sort of have skin in the game in the first place in terms of initially, finding some way to get their users and or the applications themselves contributing to the liquidity on the chain such that they can then, basically vote harder and lobby harder for their own applications to be included in those gauges over time and be part of the groups that can receive emissions from the validator set in the chain. So I hope that makes sense at a high level in terms of I don't think it reinvents the way that applications have to play, but I think it gives them an extra lever to pull.
No, I think it's interesting. I'm just trying to figure out live how this changes how applications raise money and build, right? Like it sounds like there
For
might
sure.
be less raises in the Berachain eco because they could just attract OpEx money from validators, but I
I
guess
think
that yeah.
I think sorry to interrupt, man. I think what
No, no.
we'll see is not necessarily less raises, but more less I think a lot of the rewards programs and inflation / liquidity mining programs will be a lot more validator / incentive layer dependent more than just, hey, I'm going to spit out a whole bunch of my own tokens. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that I expect to see universally. And that in many cases it's okay, if I could choose between diluting my token supply and, effectively receiving emissions in the form of a chain's native token, why wouldn't I err towards the latter? Right?
Mhm.
In terms of like cost of capital effectively to a protocol. So I think that we'll see a lot over there. Um, I think that we'll still see teams like raise to get off the ground per se and like, launch an MVP slash decent product. But I also do imagine that we'll see a pretty healthy LBP slash like, IDO or ICO or whatever you want to call it type ecosystem, because there will totally be a bunch of these groups that say, cool, I'm going to do that. I'm going to launch my native token, and then I'm going to like bribe slash incentivize validators aggressively with my native token to get as much liquidity into my pools as possible. So I think we'll also see a fun little like, PvP ecosystem start to build out over there.
That's awesome. So going back to the validator side, like they
Yeah.
get tokens from the users, like delegating to them, they earn a clip. And you also mentioned that applications can like give them tokens or sort of bribe them to direct emissions to them. I'm curious, like a couple things here. Like, is there any concern with the validators having to do this heavy, you know, you know, highly secure validation of the chain, but also making economic decisions on where to delegate to? Like, do you think that's hard or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely don't think it's easy, and I commend our validators quite a bit, and I think that we've had like a pretty grueling process for them in many cases. Whether that just be technical upkeep on the test nets, or whether that be figuring out the whole proof of liquidity system, which is by no means a walk in the park as of yet, and we're actively working to simplify. Um, I think that what it does though is it selects for like active participants that are actually going to grow the ecosystem, right? And I think that like we've seen two classes of validators emerge over time. There's some that just want to like set and forget, and I think that might be oversimplifying the work that they do. But in many cases, there's groups that don't want to do anything beyond validating, right? And that's fine. And I believe that the security of a chain is absolutely important. But I also think that I've seen a lot of ghost chains where those groups are getting the vast majority of the value generated by that network and are not contributing to it in any meaningful manner. I think what Berachain's validator protocol interactions allow for is actually a system where like those that work the hardest and or like put in the effort can really reap the rewards. Which is to say that if those validators are actively meeting the top protocols and most exciting ones in the ecosystem, are finding ways to align whether it be on these incentive deals through the marketplace, etc., or even finding ways that they can support them, whether that be with content or whether that be with like sort of more intangible type stuff, then I think that you can really have a validator like win beyond what they would have in a more traditional proof of stake system, if you will. And I think that that's where it gets really exciting, because like it's not just press button get reward. It's press button do the work, and you have an opportunity to compete your way to the top. And I am very much a believer in free markets and highly competitive marketplaces, which I think this moreover enforces. I do think that it means that it's a little bit tougher in some cases for like the solo stakers slash the solo node operators. And we're of course doing our best to figure out what else we can do there when it comes to ecosystem services or groups that want to run like effectively prime brokerages slash advisory services of this sort in the space, such that perhaps some of that work could be taken off their plate. But I think to start, our approach is, yep, you're going to validate the chain and you're going to have unprecedented control over what the economic landscape looks like. So we're going to hope you do your damn best. And of course, we'll be keeping a close eye on that to make sure that people aren't, engaging in problematic behavior.
No, it's a good explanation, right? It's definitely not easy, but it's active, right? Like you're putting the curation
Correct.
of the L1 in smart hands, I think.
You've
Um,
got it, right? And I think that's like, I just think that when I've looked at a lot of the chains that I guess I would consider ghost chains nowadays, I just think it's really confusing in many cases how you can have billions, if not, hundreds of millions or billions of TVL sitting in a validator set, accruing value to a party that in many cases is not actually growing the ecosystem. And of course, not all validators are made equal, but going back to that same thesis that I mentioned earlier, of like, if we want crypto to scale, we need to have applications that people want to use and actual users. I would perhaps say something that shouldn't always be said out loud, in that you need applications and users to be incentivized. And I don't think that a lot of chains do a great job of that at a mechanistic level at the moment. I think sure you can have your grant program and you can like throw a bunch of money at a wall and see how much of it sticks, but I don't think that that's what causes a virtuous flywheel of wins to be generated.
yeah, I think we kind of, I mean, I kind of brushed over this and I didn't really ask you and I should have, but like one of the main changes with Berachain is just you're combining, like you don't want to make a decision on security or liquidity, right? And I think that's a core
Correct.
thesis of yours.
You've
Let's
got
dive
it.
into
I
that.
think that's very much,
Yeah.
yeah. Like I just think like one of the things that prompted our whole thought process on Berachain back when it was just an NFT project was actually just talking to a whole bunch of like users and developers that had found their way into our left curve right curve ecosystem. And I think that like one of the things that we found, and this is prior to, I'd say, like, I wouldn't say the advent of, but like prior to liquid staking becoming like really really like commonplace, and definitely prior to eigenlayer type stuff, was that users were simply finding themselves with the odd trade off of like, okay, do I run a node and earn a few percent, or do I LP in a DEX or a lending market or something of the sort, right? When given a given amount of capital. And I think that's like kind of illogical, right? Because for a network to scale, you really do need both security and liquidity. I think like security has to some extent become a meme nowadays, like unfortunately, um, even though I do think it's by far incredibly important. But we've also seen so many scenarios, like I mentioned, where you have these chains with like billions securing the network and no activity on the chain at all. That I think it's I understand why it's become a little bit more of a meme, right? So I don't think you can go too far in either direction. I actually think that security and liquidity need to be like fairly equally weighted, the same side, opposite sides of the same coin. So for us, like the way that we think about it is like, why is it that those factors have to be at odds, I suppose, as opposed to why can you not generate a form of security by providing liquidity? And that is really the concept of Berachain as a whole, because what is stake but economic value? I don't think that, beyond perhaps the resilience of given assets, there is inherently greater stake value emanating from Ethereum than Solana or Near or something of the sort, right? It's ultimately the value underpinning that asset that matters. So I guess that's part of the thesis that we are, at a indirectly, getting behind.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be kind of curious your take on like Ethereum and how it's played out with Lido and Coinbase Staked ETH and Rocketpool and others. Like, is the idea that just hey, you have all this money locked up and you can't use it for other use cases, or is that like the main contention?
Yeah, I think it's right now the like effectively this form of liquid staking per se is opt in, right? Which is not bad. And in a manner it is too on Berachain. I think it's just that the reward systems on the chain much more inherently encourage people to provide liquidity in order to really reap the benefits of the system. So I guess in a world where like liquid staking was enabled by default in Ethereum or anywhere else by for that matter, I think that might be a little bit different, and like maybe there wouldn't be as much of a need or a fit for what we're doing right now. But I guess beyond that, I'd say like what we think is interesting is the ability to generalize like almost any form of liquidity into security, right? Which I don't think is even accomplishable quite in that context of liquid staking. Like I think that the fact that one can say, "Hey, I'm going to have like this LP token," and then that can serve as a form of security is pretty cool to me, because it's the same thing. It's economic stake at the end of the day. It's just an economic stake in a slightly different form.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think through like if I was a user, like not a validator and I'm not a protocol developer, like what's the best way to earn and what's the best way to like optimize the Bera eco? And it sounds like basically I have
Yeah,
two flows, right? Like I could delegate to a validator who has somehow convinced me that they're the best, or I could like obviously provide, I guess, stables to like DeFi protocols that I'm big on or that are novel.
yeah, I think there's a few different game theory paths, right? I think what ultimately is intended is for users to be able to like engage in whatever behavior they would have already, but with the added benefit of being able to like stake their BGT to secure the network, to generate fees from the different applications being built on the network, and to also earn incentives depending on what pools that validator is incentivizing, right, or receiving incentives from, I should say. Um, so like on one hand, you could totally be like, yep, I'm gonna stable farm, and then I'm gonna like, so one strategy I could totally see people doing is like stable farm to earn some BGT, and then delegate that BGT to a validator that is being incentivized by like some super wild long tail assets, right? And that way it's like, cool, I kind of have my cake and eat it too. I've got my relatively stable BGT yields from my stable pool that I'm not too worried about IL on, etc. And I'm effectively getting a call option on a whole bunch of these different assets. Or you could go the opposite route, right? And you could say, hey, I'm going to like LP in this volatile pool, or try out this new protocol that's like, spicy power perps or something of the sort, like exponents, right? And then I'm going to actually delegate to a validator that has a more stable source of like, effectively stable incentives, right? So I think it means that, like, you can actually position yourself as you'd wish. And like that's also what I think about when it comes to like the two tokens of Berachain, right? There's BGT, which is like the governance/rewards token, which is only obtainable by providing liquidity. And then there's Bera, and you can only obtain Bera, the gas token of the network, and the liquid token that will be listed, etc., by burning Bera into BGT one way, right? So it actually means that you also are given like basically a choice right at the start, right? It's, do I hold this asset that allows me to influence rewards across the network, earn fees, earn incentives, or do I speculate on the liquid token? It's really up to you.
And the burn between BGT and Bera, does that change over time? Like that
It does not. It's always 1-to-1.
Okay, cool.
And that's basically meant to like actually enforce proof of liquidity, right? In that, basically if BGT was transferable, and I should explicitly state BGT is, soul bound, non-transferable, etc., then it would kind of defeat the purpose, because people could just like earn BGT without providing liquidity, and they could just
Yeah.
buy it off each other in a marketplace, which would not be ideal. Which is
Yeah, no,
why, that hence the necessity of the model.
No, that makes sense. So it sounds like as a user, you could do this on hard mode or easy mode. Like easy mode is like
Totally.
use the apps you like and love and you'll earn BGT, or like hard mode, like here's all the things I want to provide liquidity to because X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, like you can basically just choose like how deep you want to go, right? You can go super deep in the rabbit hole and try out some crazy experimental apps that might have their own, early stage incentives and rewards programs, and 5 layers of point lasagna or whatever you want to call it, right? And then also a POL boost, hopefully, right? And take a shot that way. Or you could just say like, hey, no, I'm gonna play this pretty safe. And of course, I think that the ones that I think will be more entertaining are the users that play super risk on and are trying all the newest applications and also getting all the wildest incentives, because I really do think that is probably where you see the most exciting long tail outcomes. But I'm also sure we'll see a few different opportunities for people to get wrecked. But I think that's all in the name of the game.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I mean like the foundational asset flow of the token, like I'd love to just talk through how long your token issuance is. Like, is this a decade? Is this longer? Because that sort of
Yeah,
underpins a lot of the system here.
of course, yeah. So the token issuance is meant to be effectively infinite, because the fact is, like, you do need block rewards for POL to work, right? However, the rate of that emission is supposed to decline over time. We're discussing exact periods, but we're looking at a series of what we're thinking of as like the Bera halvenings, right? Such that that rewards rate would basically fall from 10% to 5% to 2.5 and so on and so forth over time, and hopefully over time, that value that's actually being in a perfect world, the like bribe/incentive flywheel is starting to generate a lot of the value on the network by itself from that massive applications building around each other.
I mean, we have an opportunity to call this forest fires, but it's like a weird feeling for
Yeah, it could go both ways. Could go both ways.
Yeah, no, it totally could. So
Might get some environmental concerns on that one.
yeah, like it
We'll not be able to have the green blockchain narrative.
the Smokey the Bear memes though, like when the halving comes around,
Might sell themselves.
yeah, it's so good. One concern I want to talk to you about was like not a one for one comparison by any means, but BitTensor has a sort of interesting model, right? Where validators sort of pick the subnets that they want, and those
Mhm.
subnets earn tokens. And what I found is it's a pretty political game. It's obviously very competitive and it's expensive, but
Yeah, yeah.
how do you ensure that this doesn't devolve into, these applications playing straight politics with the validators? Or is that the goal?
I don't think it's the goal, but I think in many cases it's a state that the system could tend towards. And I think that the only like clear answer to that is actually, on one hand, letting a free market play out, and on the other hand, like actually doing a good job of staying diligent on top of those different metrics, and effectively like um, when something seems rational, when there's and versus when there's a clear cabal/sketchy situation going on, right? And I don't think that it's our job to be the police. I don't think it's our job to overly involve ourselves in matters of the state per se. But I also do think that if we see threats towards decentralization, if we see groups acting in a manner that we could ultimately see threatening the network, then it is ultimately our job to look at that in terms of delegations, in terms of effectively bootstrapping programs, and anything that we can do to work against that effort. Right. So, and it's a great comparison. Actually, I haven't heard many people talk about any similarities in the Tau ecosystem before. I've heard different people think about it in the context of like AVSs and groups choosing which AVSs they actually want to work with, and so on and so forth. Like from a node operator perspective, I think that there's probably some reasonable comps there as well. But I think that for better or for worse, politics will always find their way in the system. But I do think that the amount of different counterparties here, in terms of like a set of 256 validators at least, and hundreds of applications that we already see building on the network, should make it relatively difficult for a group like that to form too concretely. Like I think there'll be a lot of different options for people who want to take shots.
Yeah, it's always been my thesis, like the most, and it's just such an obvious thesis, right? Like the app layer or the L1 that has the most shots on goal wins, and like you have Ethereum, then you have Eigenlayer, and now sort of it seems like you're sort of influencing a similar design here, which is great to hear.
Yeah, you've got it. And I think that's exactly it, right? Like shots on net is what ultimately leads to breakout protocols. And I think that our goal in building an ecosystem is to ensure that we have as many of those like landmarks, if you will, that people think of and they're like, oh yes, I associate this application with this chain, right? Or I want to go to this chain specifically to use that application. And there's been many examples of these in the past. Some have ended really well, some have ended not so well, like, Anchor and Luna that like did not necessarily end the best, but it also brought a whole bunch of people into that ecosystem while it was kicking, right? Like GMX and Arbitrum have done a great job for the ecosystem. I would even maybe put Pendle in that group despite starting on mainnet. DFK and Harmony before the Lock Jewel fiasco. Like I think we've seen so many of these landmarks, and the real key to Berachain winning is being able to help as many of these landmarks to reach that point where they actually do become that, and they become these centerpieces or these attractions that people travel cross chain to come and see.
Yeah, it's definitely super interesting. I'd like to ask you like just the basic chain level questions too. Like, is
Sure.
there any like just like TPS fees we probably won't be able to figure out until you're live, but I'd love to maybe TPS would be helpful so people can get a
Yeah, yeah,
mental
for
model
sure.
versus other chains.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Look, like Bear Chains by no means. We're not in the parallelization race. We love the boys who are doing so and have lots of respect for what they're doing. But I think we know our arena and we stick to it. Like when you look at like basic transfers and stuff, like 700 TPS. When you look at like more practical stuff like swaps and whatnot, it's not super fast. It's like 50 or something like that. So it'll definitely be an experience that like feels. We want it to feel a lot better than mainnet, of course. Like we're looking at like sub 2 second block times right now, but I don't think it'll be as snappy as like the Solana like experience that we'd love to get to over time.
No, that it's helpful. It's helpful because you could kind of influence like what applications should be built on the L1 versus I'm guessing potential L2s on your chain too.
You've got it, and I guess on a similar note, right? Like Bearchain is the first L1 at least that we know of and that we've seen that's actually EVM identical. Which is to say that while we use Comet BFT consensus under the hood for single slot finality, the execution environment itself is actually like fully identical to the ETH2 spec. In that you can run, any of the different execution clients, you can run Nethermind, you can run Reth, you can run, like Geth, what have you, Aragon, so on and so forth. And you don't have to make any modifications. We don't have to maintain a fork. So really, if there's anything, whether that be the EIPs, et cetera, that one has on mainnet, you'll also have that on Berachain. So which also means that from an L2/scaling ecosystem point of view, it's super easy to work with. And we've actually already seen probably 3 or 4 different groups trying to build L2s to Berachain, whether they be gaming focused with like tons of users and transactions, consumer focused, or like sort of deep low latency clean mempool trading focused as well. And then I think that opens up a whole different world of possibilities for what cross-chain proof liquidity looks like, and having entire L2s or applications on L2s incentivized by the Berachain core consensus effectively.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, it's cool to see where this could go. I was going to ask if you foresee validators like um, delegating to a Berachain L2 anytime soon, but maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves.
No, no, but I don't think you're wrong though, right? Like I think that's entirely a world that could exist, and I think especially for like app chains, I could see that making a lot of sense. You could have some exchange where validators are effectively forwarding, some portion of their sequencer fees or something of the sort towards, the BGT stakers, in exchange for, receiving some portion of BGT emissions that could be used for incentives across the chain, right? So I think there's just a whole bunch of those different systems, DYDX type stuff that could exist.
Yeah, no, that is pretty cool. Switching gears a little bit, um, it seems like there's maybe like an undercurrent of exhaustion with the community and VCs around infra investments, right? I don't want to speak for ourselves or anyone in particular, but like Paradigm just launched $1 billion fund, and I think it's like app focused. There are like a couple high profile chains launching, like yourselves. There's Blast, there's Monad, there's several others. But I'm curious, like, do you think that the market is ready for a new L1? Like, do you think they're exhausted, or how are you feeling about that? Because you guys also
Yeah,
raised,
no, it's
a bunch of money. Sorry.
For sure. No, 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 you're good, man. It's a great question. And honestly, look, if we came out the box as a naked L1 right now, in terms of, there wasn't any ecosystem, there wasn't a sort of traction, there was just like the classic, hey, we came up with like some funky new consensus and we spun out of like, insert X research institution or FANG here, then I think we'd be fucked. I think that'd be a horrible situation to be in. But what I can very thankfully say is that like, I think we've done the exact opposite of that. I think we spent the last couple of years, deeply curating an application ecosystem that's quite thoughtful and has a whole bunch of interplay. I think we've got one of the most rabid and, autistic in some manners, savants and others communities that one could ask for. And I think that we've got a lot of the right tailwinds to actually see innovation at the application layer, which is really what I think Berachain encourages more than anything else. Like turning liquidity into security fundamentally enables these applications to dial in more on their capital efficiency and enables that validator set to help them get off the ground. And I think that with that, like what's actually been most exciting recently is seeing that pigeonhole expand. Like I think there was a point at which people sort of just thought of us as a DeFi chain, but now we're seeing a ton of different experiments, building the Berachain ecosystem, whether that be SocialFi, whether that be DeepIn. We've got groups building effectively like DeepIn Nintendo Switches, Vape to Earn, which is perhaps one of the
Oh
funniest things
man.
I've heard of as a non-vaper.
Wow.
Prediction markets on Twitch streams. Like I think that like the sky really is the limit. Um, and I think that the market should be exhausted of infrastructure, but I don't think that the market should be exhausted for new applications building on exciting enabling infrastructure, which is what I'd hope that we can see ourselves as. And thankfully, we're done our time on the fundraising trail. Now it's just our job to do our best to help the teams that are building on the ecosystem to reach their potential and to have as great of an experience as we did.
So I have to ask, you guys announced your 100 mil fundraise, I think like a month or 2 months ago. And obviously congrats. You have Framework, Brevin Howard, like incredible funds in there, really smart people. I'm curious though, like how do you spend $100 million? Like the number, it just seems so high to me. Like,
Not easily.
yeah, it's
Yeah, and like, look, we really try to err away from the pay to play partnerships. I think we've seen plague, or perhaps work with other chains in the past. And we actually have a pretty strict no grants policy internally at Berachain as well. So the answer is, I think, very sparingly. In that we try to be incredibly resilient about our fund, about our our team size. We try to be incredibly efficient when it comes to our spending, and not just flaunting random stuff. People give a shit every now and then for like having a boat in Dubai that had like all of our ecosystem builders. That costs like a tenth of most of the things that people threw on like top floors of hotels and stuff. So I guess every step of the way we think a lot about bang for our buck. I think a lot of it comes down to payroll. Of course, we want to be able to make sure that the foundation and the entities that are in the Berachain ecosystem can sustain for years to come. Because otherwise, the alternative in most cases, at least from what we've seen in our proxies, is just like selling tokens, which I don't think is something that we want to do, especially post launch. And then I think that beyond that, there are definitely certain like strategic opportunities where it's like, hey, this can unlock something massive for the chain, whether it be geopolitical relationships, whether it be massive new applications coming on board that actually have crypto applications, or whether it simply be means of actually injecting more capital into the ecosystem. So that's a long-winded way of saying that we don't have a particular roadmap for exactly where those funds go, of course, beyond infrastructure costs, payroll, et cetera, which certainly add up. But our goal is to make them last as long as possible and to make sure the foundation and the labs entities are endowed for, the next 5, 10 plus years.
no, it's awesome. It's just it's super cool to see like to be that well funded for that long because you're not really in a rush. But the flip side I'd offer is like I saw a lot of L1s. I'll throw Tezos in there as a really good example. Like really smart team, like respect them.
Yeah,
Like it was a really cool idea. It still is, but they raised so much money. I think they have hundreds of millions in ETH. I'm dating myself. Maybe they sold it, but
yeah.
like it seems like the flip side is if you don't spend the money aggressively and really make a foothold while the hype is there, it's sort of just it becomes a slush fund, right? So I guess like
Of
there is
course.
some impetus to like spend that as you can pretty aggressively.
And I think that like all the way that so to give it a little bit more nuance, right? I think that the way that we think about it is if we can spend the capital in an asymmetric manner, we should do so. But if we spend the capital for the sake of it, I don't think we will. The next one that we think about as really asymmetric for ourselves and the ecosystem as a whole is really just going absolutely ham on international expansion. We're glad to already have teams on the ground in Korea, Shenzhen, India, Dubai, and actually one person in LATAM now. But we know that can expand. We know there's a massive market, especially across Southeast Asia and more places in Asia, honestly, that we haven't tapped yet. We know there's a ton of work to be done in Africa. We know there's a ton of work to be done in Latin America. And I want to make sure that we have outposts and we have people actually helping to grow those communities and, bring more and more people on chain as well, right? So without getting like, too corny, I really do think that like, part of the Berachain vision is actually helping to bring people who could have real uses for crypto beyond the Magic Online Casino, into the fray. And I want to make sure that we don't miss out on that opportunity either. So I think it's fair to say that a non-trivial percent of the funds raised will go towards greater establishing our presences and sort of growth efforts over there. And a lot of other ones will just go towards deals that we think can, take the ecosystem to the next level. But I don't think there's ever a point at which we'll look to ourselves and be like, oh man, we didn't spend like $5 this year. We gotta go blow that real quick on some sponsorships, right? But
Yeah, we're behind.
I you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I do think that we will 100% be like, yeah, like that one looks like it's going to return 10x. Let's make that happen.
Another thing I want to ask you on is just competitive dynamics. Like you open up the podcast and you stated like an EVM identical L1, right? And that was a key point you mentioned, and I agree that it is important, right? So that kind of begs the question, like, is there like how do you view the effort of like attracting, vampire attacking, convincing existing ETH apps to move over, right? And I preface this with like you want to attract the good apps too, right? Not the ones that are dead and can't fund. So like it gets kind of interesting.
Of course. And like, I think you attract two types of apps as a new ecosystem, maybe three. One for us is we care the most about our native applications, our native builders, right? They're the ones who've been, sort of Berachain ride or die from the start. They've always been, Bera aligned per se. They plan to launch tokens on the chain, which is something that we care about a whole bunch as well. And one of the biggest, misses we've seen in recent chain launches has been a lack of other assets to speculate on in an ecosystem when the gas token is already, very highly valued, et cetera. So I think that's something that we think is super important. And also just like it gives it that opportunity to have that snowballing wealth creation effect, right? So native builders come number one. I think number two in that equation come, like sort of the giants per se, or the groups that we've known for quite some time, and that have, seen a massive track record of success in other chains. I think that they play two purposes. On one hand, they play value in terms of signaling and saying, hey, trust me, guys, these guys are legit, like, real chain, etc. But on the other hand, depending on when they come, they can actually be quite value extractive. If it means that, a new application or, a known blue chip is coming to that chain, but it's not giving any emissions out, it's not launching a token or anything over there, it's just sort of, attracting more TVL and providing a service, which is great for the constituents of that network, but may not effectively have the same upside that some of those native apps might have. And then I think a third bucket is those groups that were struggling to sort of break out or make it out the hood on mainnet or Arbitrum or Optimism or wherever else they might be, and are sort of looking at a fresh coat of paint or a second shot at things. And I think that there's also a pretty meaningful space for those too, as long as the core ideas have enough potential as well. So, I guess the way we think about it is you have to be PvP in these environments. And it's sort of like, it's it's built around your chain until it isn't, I guess. In that, I think there's certainly a point where there's a degree of critical mass built in the ecosystem where one can afford to be more wagmy and afford to be like, yeah, we want this application on every chain. But I think I would probably, I devil's advocate that statement with a couple of different thoughts, right? One, I don't think we've really seen any successful, truly cross-chain apps, with the exception of sort of Uni, Aave, like
I guess Thorchain.
like there's,
maybe that's not really an app, but yeah,
exactly, right. So I actually think that a lot of the cross-chain stuff is like the ultimate mid-curve move, because people think that they will expand their market, they'll expand their TAM and they'll have a whole bunch of new customers flowing into them and new users, but actually they just end up diluting their user base on one chain in favor of another that doesn't really care about them either. So I think you need to take super concentrated bets to win. So, going back to your question, recapping my whole thoughts, we want to be able to bring some of the OGs that we have a lot of love and respect for over to Berachain. We care the most about the native ecosystem. We also want to be able to give some of these, applications that had a good shake at things on mainnet or other chains, but, didn't quite make it to that level of breakout potential that they could have, and give them an opportunity to ride again, if you will. And we mostly just care about building and seeing cool new things that we couldn't have seen anywhere else before. No matter what category that might fall into. And we have no issue, basically working to bring them over from other groups, if we do really believe that they can have a better home here. And that doesn't apply to everyone, but it definitely applies to a lot of people.
No, that's a great answer. So just switching gears a little bit, we have like around 10 minutes left before we usually call quits. We'll see where we go. I just want to make sure I get these in. So you raised a lot of money. You built a great community. and the story's down, you guys are building, right? One question I have for you is like, during that fundraise process, maybe for the VCs listening or for the other founders, I'm curious, like, what were maybe the hardest question or two that you had to answer from a fund, right? Like somebody that really maybe not stumped you, but really got you thinking, or maybe influenced the project in such a way. And you don't have to name names, but I'm just curious,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the best questions you got.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about this one for a second because I'm not gonna lie, our last fundraise is like pretty easy, in
No, that's a
terms of
good
like,
thing. Maybe, yeah, you handled it the first go around.
I yeah, well, like, I just think that like there was a lot of. I think that the biggest question that VCs often have to diligence on a new chain is like, do people actually want to build stuff here, right? And I don't think that was a very hard question for them to answer with Berachain, between the levels of social and I guess and I guess just like evidence proof here, right? So I think that that was definitely a lot easier. I think that there were certainly concerns at different points about like, okay, are validators going to want to participate in a system where they aren't earning the majority of their block rewards? And I think that the same answer that I gave you a little bit earlier was one that made a lot of sense for people, where it's like, actually, I think it's just a matter of screening for the validators that real truly be drivers of value more than anything else. So I think that was certainly part of it. Just
No,
trying
it's
to think
good.
what else. I think
It's good
I
that
I
it's
think
crazy how like easy the last round was too. Like that's a good sign because that means you pretty much
yeah, yeah.
nailed it the first time around.
And like, look, I'll contrast. Like the Series A was definitely not quite as easy. It was happening as FTX blew up. We had, I think, Canto was like live at the same time, and people are like, "Oh, isn't this just like Canto, but like not?" And we're just like, "No, it's very different." We have a lot of respect for those guys, but I think two fundamentally different approaches. One is tying liquidity to security. The other is sort of like having a bunch of these applications built on top of the chain, which is cool. And I think they've done a great job of building over the last little while. But I remember, I think that was the arc in which people were like asking us a whole bunch about Canto and Evmos. And I think this year we had a lot more people asking us about like, okay, like what is the massive audacious vision for this look like? You know what? I guess one question we got was people were like, hey, Berachain's like got a very crypto native brand. How do you think about actually scaling beyond that, right? And how do you think about like going to the corporates, the institutions, etc. And I also do think that when we were able to say that the Brevin Howard Digital was co-leading the round, that helped assuage a lot of concerns over there.
Oh yeah.
And because when you think about feds, I think those folks are about as fed as it gets, relatively speaking, in the crypto space.
Please don't
And I think
focus on
also being able to
corporates though.
demonstrate.
I
Yeah,
can't go through
no,
permission chains again and public chains that are.
no, no, no.
Yeah.
That's not it at all. I think it's more just understanding that like there's actually a lot of ways to focus on corporates that can be well abstracted from the core Berachain brand per se, right? And stuff in our scaling roadmap, the L2s, et cetera, are very much up that alley as well. There's a group that's being built right now that will probably announce a fundraise in the next few weeks. That is, some of the most seasoned gaming / gambling entrepreneurs that we know of in the space. We're building a chain for consumer social that's already basically got 100 million users lined up from different applications that are building on there. That'll all be rolling up to Bera, right? So like, there's 100, there's a number of different ways to spin Bera, and I think that like that's part of the beauty of it when I reflect on it, right? Like, it is very much a many sided die. There's people who look at it as some sort of a wonky bridge between the worlds of Cosmos and Ethereum, though I honestly try to stay pretty far away from Cosmos. My apologies. There's groups who view it as like the ultimate like LST / capital efficiency chain. There's groups who view it as eigenlayer for shitcoins. There's groups who view it as a DeFi chain. Like, there's just so many different
Depends who
ways
you
of
ask.
looking at it. Yeah, exactly. And I actually think that like a little bit beyond that is like the anonymous nature means that we could really be just about anyone. Um, I think that over time it's hopefully become evident that we're not complete goofballs, though we're definitely, fairly goofy. But there's a team that's built some of the first protocols in DeFi, that's, shipped meaningful products to millions of people in the trad tech world. It's managed and deployed billions of capital collectively. Um, I think that having that breadth of experiences really does allow us to draw on a number of different angles for where Berachain goes over time. So yeah, I think that we're pretty excited for that.
No, I definitely think it's exciting. I guess what do you I guess like what are you most excited about slash most concerned with over the next let's use crypto time. So like maybe the next 30 to 60 days. Anything beyond that doesn't matter. But maybe we could talk like
Yeah, yeah.
mainnet launch, next steps, and go from there.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I think that like right now we're just in the middle of all the very fun stuff in terms of like incentive design and what that just like launch plan looks like. In terms of times at which we want to effectively enable different applications to like start tapping into proof of liquidity beyond like the three ones that are built into the chain that I mentioned, right? It's like, okay, cool. Like, when is it safe to flip that switch? Thinking about effectively means that we can actually help attract liquidity into the different applications in the ecosystem, thinking about some of our airdrop mechanics. I think all those things are top of mind. And then also thinking about a ton of the applications that are like now at their MVP stage and are ready to raise new rounds. Like, there's already been, I think, close to $50 million worth of investment in the Berachain like app layer ecosystem prior to the chain going live. But while that's by no means a measure of success, it's more just, I think, showing that people are willing to take bets on apps in Berachain, right? And I think that we want to be able to see that continuing to snowball, and of course, seeing that going to good applications. So you'll probably also see a couple announcements in the next couple of days that will continue in force from that point. So yeah, man, I think it's mechanism design stuff. It's liquidity acquisition program type stuff. It is funky airdrop type stuff. It's wrangling custodians and all that kind of fun stuff that I'm sure you guys have had to deal with in some manner as well, and probably do not have much love for either. And then doing our best to support teams. I guess the last bit of that is like, I think that we've seen a lot of other groups sort of take a binary approach in which like they either focus really hard on the Western ecosystem or they focus really hard on the Eastern ecosystem, like the Hong Kong and Korea bit, and just forget about everything else. And I think that ultimately leads to like some community feeling alienated, right? Our goal is to do our best to cover as many bases as we can, and that's also a focus over the next 30 to 60 days, especially in the Asian ecosystem, without spreading ourselves too thin to the point of trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I mean, shameless plug here, but if any cool teams are building on Bera looking for funding, my DMs are always open. Sorry there, Smokey, but would love to support.
No, I got you. Yeah, no, I'm happy to send cool guys your way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Smokey, this is awesome. I mean, I really I think it's really cool meeting teams that can really crush both sides of the curve. Like, the middle of the curve does not exist, right? It's just memes and fun and good vibes, and really smart devs on the other, and you're building something novel. So I think it's really cool, and I really appreciate your time coming on the podcast to explain it to me.
No, cheers, man. Really appreciate it. You asked some really thoughtful questions, and I think poked at some of the right parts of this, and made me think about some stuff that I haven't had to consider for a little while. So really appreciate the process. And if there's anything that I can ever be helpful with, just let me know, and I'd love to do so beyond sending cool teams your way.
Hell yeah. Well, Smokey, I'll talk soon.
Cheers, man.